pro bono counsel for 15 years. And then
Hello, everyone.
we applied for the money. I left.
Yeah, we could spread out.
All right.
My name is Matt Lifson. I'm an attorney at Policy Integrity, and I'll be moderating the second panel. This panel will carry forward on many of the themes and questions that were brought up during the first panel, but more in the style of our recent keynote. It will kind of smush those concepts up against the law. And there's an increasing number of statutes and regulations, some of which we've talked about already, that talked about already, that call for the measurement of emissions, including Scope 2 emissions. This collision of emissions accounting regimes and the law raises all sorts of questions about what types of regimes are legally allowed or required, the political feasibility of different requirements, the preferences of different interest groups, the climate consequences of adopting different approaches, and how the courts will react. So for reference at the very beginning, I've thrown up a visual aid of 4 quotations from 4 of the legal sources that we'll be talking about today. First, the definition of life cycle emissions from the 45V tax credit. I also have up the SEC's, what the SEC said about Scope 2 emissions in their climate disclosure regulation. I have up the GHG Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund statute that provides money for organizations to fund projects that reduce emissions. And I also have up the Colorado Clean Heat Law that requires gas distribution utilities to achieve certain emissions reductions benchmarks. There's others, of course, I think we'll talk about more than these 4, and this visual aid will return after certain of our panelists' slides. Now I'll introduce our panelists. We have Professor Yona. She is an interdisciplinary legal scholar with a robust background in climate science. She recently joined Cornell Law as an assistant professor of law. Her expertise lies in the intersection of law and climate science, policy, and justice. She also completed her PhD in environment and resources at Stanford. Her research addresses the challenges and gaps in GHG inventorying and seeks to enhance the accuracy and efficacy of climate laws and policies. Next to me is Dr. Budden. He leads the Natural Resources Defense Council's global and U.S. regional level hydrogen policy work. Prior to NRDC, he researched next-generation solar energy technology, earning his PhD in physics and undertaking a postdoctoral fellowship. He also worked for the Climate Change Committee in the UK as an industrial decarbonization analyst, where he modeled decarbonization pathways for the UK industrial sector. His work informed the UK's NDC and 6th carbon budget targets. Also on the panel with us is Commissioner Tom Plant of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. He was appointed to the commission by Governor Polis. Prior to his appointment, he served as the director of Governor Ritter's Energy Office, with principal responsibility for developing and implementing the governor's policies for a new energy economy. He previously worked as an exploration geologist and also at the Union of Concerned Scientists, exploring the causes of global climate change and examining transportation and energy solutions. And finally, we have Michael Gergen. Michael Gergen is a senior strategic advisor and counsel at the Coalition for Green Capital. He's also an adjunct professor of law here, where he regularly teaches a course on energy law, regulation, and policy, and periodically gives public lectures on pressing energy issues. He was previously a partner at Latham & Watkins, where he was in the project finance and energy regulatory and markets groups. He also has a degree in applied economics. The structure of this panel is that first we'll hear introductory remarks from each of the panelists, then I'll moderate a discussion, then we'll take audience questions, again using the index cards on your table, and the order in which we'll hear our introductory remarks are Professor Yona, then Dr. Budden, Commissioner Plant, and then Michael Gergen.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all okay? Wonderful. So first of all, thank you so much to IPI for having us and convening this panel, and especially thank you to all of the admin and staff who've been putting together the food and the logistics. This is kind of an amazing size of people, and so I'm sure that's taken a lot of work. So I really appreciate you all being here. I think we talked a little bit about the importance of equity to accelerate decarbonization in our first panel, and just kind of in the spirit of acknowledging how important that is, I do want to just acknowledge that where we are right now is the traditional lands of the Mohican and Munsili people. I do think that as we're kind of having these very high-level conversations about policy, we really need to make sure that we have that equity as well, and kind of those relationships that we're building and trust to kind of make sure that these policies are successful. So I am really excited to be here because I spend a lot of my time trying to convince people that emissions accounting matters, and I'm usually the only person in the room. And so I'm glad that we are all among friends here who can nerd out about all of these different challenges. And so just to get a sense of who's in the room, and also acknowledging that I'm the first person to be speaking after you have begun digesting your lunch, maybe we could just quickly raise your hand and tell me just, if you're coming from an industry or private background, who's in the room? Okay. What about government? Okay. What about academia, NGO, think tanks? Okay, interesting. Okay, so my goal is to try to cover a lot of ground in a little time by just providing a brief overview of the history of emissions accounting and kind of where we are today. So, there we go. Okay. In many ways, I want to start with what we're to look at the history by starting with the present day. So this is the moment that the Paris Agreement, was officially ratified in 2015, and within the Paris Agreement goals at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as many of you know, I am sure, the large, kind of a huge foundation of that agreement rests on having governments, national governments, have a nationally determined contribution to reduce their overall emissions, right? So emissions reductions by a particular date, based on a particular time. And so true to how important this is to the agreement, there is language that talks about how inventorying ought to take place. So I'm just putting in, oh my God. I'm just putting in a quick excerpt of that transparency framework, Article 13. And I want to draw your attention to three things here. First, there's, in the very first sentence here, we've got a requirement. So parties to the agreement, national governments, are required to provide inventories of their emissions, but more specifically, they need to actually use good practice methodologies, and actually good practice methodologies that are developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And so, for the non-lawyers in the room, you might look at this and think, okay, well, this seems pretty robust to me. We've got good practice methodologies, robust scientific body, but there are actually a lot of exclusions in these inventories. I think it was Michael in the first panel who was talking about the GHG protocol being outdated. Something like you can't expect anything to be, extremely accurate after 20 years. Well, these IPCC methods were last fully revised in 2006. And so what we end up having at this international level are these exclusions, where international aviation and international shipping emissions, for example, are outside the purview of the Paris Agreement, even though if you took that sector alone and ranked them as if they were a country, they would rank 8th in the world. And so, I kind of want to point all of this out because in many ways, these guidelines, these IPCC methods have set the framework or the foundation for a lot of the emissions accounting policies and protocols that we see today. And if we're to actually before I do that, let me just say, if we're thinking about also the context of the Paris Agreement, we have this emergence, as many of you are working in looking at both having voluntary disclosures from non-state actors, from corporations and subnational governments, which are not formally parties to the UN process. And so we had this flurry of pledges, especially in the post-Paris years under the Trump administration. And now there's been this shift to have mandated, required disclosures of various companies. And so I'll just briefly mention them, and I'm sure there'll probably be questions about this, and I can talk about my views of the various disclosures in more detail if people are interested. But effectively, we've got the SEC here, right, at a national level in the US. That's kind of has finalized rules for disclosure that are currently kind of being pending a lot of litigation, but we also have at a subnational level, the state of California had Senate Bill 253, which I'm happy to talk about more, but requires disclosure of emissions for any company operating in California with revenue of over $1 billion. And then at the U, we've got, of course, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And so in many ways, a lot of those voluntary, we have a lot of voluntary efforts that had kind of come out in response to the Paris Agreement, but also then these mandated disclosures in many ways are kind of based on these IPCC guidelines, which could be improved, I would argue. So just very, very quickly, if you're to think about what the impacts might be of poor greenhouse gas accounting practices or incomplete or inaccurate practices, what you're seeing here is the total aggregate emissions that were submitted by parties to the UN process for the year 2019 as part of their Paris Agreement obligations. So if you're to take all of the national governments' inventory reports for that particular year, I believe the total comes up to something like 42 billions of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that dashed line is the target peak emissions that the IPCC in a separate report indicated ought to be the kind of threshold if we wanted to stay within a global average temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. And so you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, well, we're close to the threshold, but at least we haven't passed it. And of course, because I just told you that those guidelines exclude a lot of emission sources, when you add those excluded emissions, we end up going past that threshold. And so just quickly, at the heart of these policies is this idea, I argue, that emissions accounting isn't just about measuring emissions, at least not for those of us who are in the room here who are thinking about how this applies to law and policy. It's really about creating the accountability structures that push for actual real reductions. And so when we have governments and companies disclosing their emissions, part of that disclosure is involves, in my view, taking ownership over those emissions and ownership over those emissions reductions. And so we need to make sure that we don't have these kinds of accounting shortfalls in our standards if we actually want our policies to be really effective in leading to emissions reductions that actually address the overall climate crisis. So on that very positive note, I will thank you and happy to take any questions.
Go wherever.
Okay, thanks so much to IPI for hosting us all today and having me on this panel. It's a pleasure and a surprise to see so many interested faces around emissions accounting. My name is Pete Budden. I'm a hydrogen advocate at the Climate and Energy Department of the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC's mission is to safeguard the Earth, its people, its plants and animals, and the natural systems on which all life depends. And that involves hydrogen because to do that job, to safeguard the Earth, we need to reach net zero. And to do that, there's certain hard-to-abate sectors where hydrogen is going to be a really important tool. Sectors like steelmaking, fertilizers, and shipping. In particular, we want to see electrolytic hydrogen powered by renewables to fill that role. But as you've already heard today, making electrolytic hydrogen, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, is extremely energy intensive. If you power electrolysis using electricity generated by fossil fuels, it's actually much more emissions intensive than just producing it directly from natural gas as we do today, 2 to 4 times more emissions intensive. So if we're going to talk about clean electrolytic hydrogen, we really need to make sure that the energy that goes into that process is genuinely clean. And that requires emissions accounting framework for Scope 2 electricity. As you've heard already today, I don't want to be too repetitive, but 45V is obviously the place where that discussion about what that framework should look like has played out in the US over the last couple of years, as well as in the EU. 45V is a really substantial tax credit, and because it's so generous and because it is paid out, is uncapped, as has been pointed out, and is paid out for every kilogram of hydrogen that you produce that meets an emissions threshold, it could be a perverse incentive to just use more and more energy on the grid, and so it needs those guardrails in place. And the guardrails that have been proposed by the Treasury and that have been ratified in the EU are the 3 pillars. Just quickly, in the specific hydrogen context, the 3 pillars are incrementality, hourly matching, and geographic deliverability. So incrementality, that's requiring new or incremental energy to be used, making sure we're not diverting clean power that's already serving the grid. That would require us to backfill that energy, likely with whatever's on the margin in the grid at that moment in time. And for much of the US, that's usually fossil fuels that's on the margin that would ramp up to backfill. So that's why we need incrementality. Hourly matching is matching up of the power you consume every hour with power being generated in that same hour. This is really important when you're using variable renewables that don't produce the same amount of energy each hour and day of the year. Importantly for hydrogen projects, but also for any big user of energy, having hourly emissions accounting really incentivizes projects to be designed with demand response in mind. There's various different electrolyzer technologies available on the market which are more or less able to ramp up in response to economic signals, the availability of clean energy, and if we give out a subsidy that doesn't take into account which hour power is used in, you would just want to run 24/7, 100% of the time, and that puts a real strain on the grid, and it results in a lot of emissions. Hourly matching sends a signal to project designers to design with flexibility in mind, so we can have electrolyzers be good grid citizens. Finally, we have geographic deliverability, which is the need to contract for power that's physically deliverable to you, typically by locating in the same region of the grid, making sure there's no transmission constraints between the generation of the power and where it's being used to make hydrogen. I think it's important to note what's at stake here for the hydrogen industry. It's really the credibility of this fuel as a solution at all. If we don't put these guardrails in place, hydrogen will not be a climate solution. We'll have dirty hydrogen being labeled as clean and potentially being subsidized with taxpayer dollars and making the climate worse at the same time. So there's a lot at stake here for hydrogen, especially around credibility and public trust. I think it's really interesting to see hydrogen grapple with these questions because it's going to apply to so much more. In the next few years, we're seeing the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 discussion begin, and I think a lot of what we've learned from the hydrogen debate in the last couple of years can be applied to that question too. One really important thing that I want to highlight is the importance of transparency and governance around how these emissions accounting frameworks are put together. Unfortunately, we've seen in the ISO standard for hydrogen, which is the International Standards Organization, a process that is it's underway still. There's a draft kind of being produced based on a technical standard. And if you look at that technical standard, none of these guardrails are in place because we don't have the right people at the table. We just have industry an industry-dominated process writing the rules for themselves around how they want to account for their emissions. And that's led to a draft standard for hydrogen that doesn't contain any of the 3 pillars, doesn't account for indirect grid emissions, and we need to see the Greenhouse Gas Protocol avoid that outcome. I'm optimistic that will happen, and we need to make sure that everyone here stays engaged and and feeds into that process. One other thing that hasn't been mentioned that I would be remiss if I didn't is that hydrogen itself has an indirect warming impact, and if your hydrogen system leaks a lot, that can undo a lot of the emissions savings of your of displacing fossil fuels with hydrogen. So that's something that's not included in any accounting framework yet, but needs to be at some point. We need a pathway to including the warming impact of hydrogen itself and assessing the leakage rates the same way we do for methane. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Should I go ahead and talk from there? Yeah. Thank you very much. So my name is Tom Plant. I'm here from Colorado, and I'll give you a little bit of perspective that where I'm coming from in terms of this. In Colorado, we are fortunate, one of the only states, I think, in the Intermountain West that has a real alignment among the regulatory environment, the legislative environment, the administration, all to address climate change and to address it head on. A lot of this has been led by legislation. And at the Public Utilities Commission, we aren't air regulators, but we are tasked with the responsibility of implementing the climate legislation through the regulation of the utilities. About 15 years ago, we started partnering between the Public Utilities Commission and the air regulators, the Department of Environment. So if there are requirements within the statutes and the utility submits a plan, our air regulators then certify that that plant will achieve the various different reductions that are in the legislation. And so that's kind of the context with which we've moved forward in Colorado. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the most recent legislation that we've been implementing, which is the Clean Heat Plan. And our Clean Heat Plan is targeted at natural gas utilities. And natural gas utilities need to achieve a 22% or submit plans to achieve a 22% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. As a little bit of context, we also have legislation that required the electric utilities to submit plans to achieve at least an 80% reduction in their carbon emissions by 2030. And we just recently approved a clean energy plan that gets our biggest utility, which is Xcel Energy, to 86% reductions by 2030. And Ms. Batchelder was here earlier talking about the impacts of the IRA. I can tell you that we started that proceeding prior to the IRA. And in phase one of that proceeding, there was 3 times the amount of gas in that plan that ended up in the plan after the IRA. And that's the kind of impact, that's a kind of on-the-ground impact that the IRA actually had in Colorado on the generation mix. But because we were able to get to that 86% reduction by 2030, the electric sector is the clean sector. So we were, I think in the first panel, you're hearing a lot about, electrifying is great as long as the electric sector is decarbonized. We're going to be largely there by 2030 after we're closing in the next 6 years. We're closing 9 coal plants that add up to 4,300 megawatts and replacing that with clean energy generation. So we will largely be there. The question now is how do we move all of these other emitting sources to that clean resource. And that's where the Clean Heat Plan comes in. So legislation requiring natural gas utilities to submit plans for reducing their carbon emissions. Gas utilities generally are not big fans of electrification for obvious reasons, right? So we haven't received any plans from the gas utilities that point to the biggest way of reducing those emissions. So what we're left with is a requirement on the large utility that that would increase beneficial electrification primarily in our heating sector in the buildings. We also have electrification plans in the transportation sector, but that's kind of separate. But no way of allocating those emissions reductions to the gas utilities because they're not a part of that gas utility plan. So what we're looking at in the Public Utilities Commission is we've got 46 utilities in the state of Colorado, 2 of which we regulate at the Public Utilities Commission. We've got a handful of gas utilities. Some of the electric utilities are serving some gas customers, serving other gas customers, some propane customers. You've got some that are both electric and gas in the same company, but that's a relatively small number. So we're looking at how do we address that seams issue between the electric utilities that we don't regulate, the gas companies that we do regulate, none of which have submitted plans for beneficial electrification, in order to achieve those 22% reductions, which the gas companies say they cannot achieve because they're not doing beneficial electrification. So we're looking to go back to the legislature now and try and create some sort of a beneficial electrification emissions credit that we can require the gas companies to purchase from the electric companies in order to achieve compliance with this 22% standard by 2030. So what we were given from the legislature was, the gas companies need to achieve this reduction, but the tools that we have in order to achieve that aren't there. So we're looking to creating really an emissions structure within the beneficial electrification area in order to achieve those kinds of emissions reductions, because right now we just have no mechanism for ensuring that that'll happen. So that's our challenge. Any of you guys have great ideas, we're all up for it. And that's all I have. Thanks.
There we go, great. Hi all. Everybody wake up. You've had your lunch, right? Everybody wants to take a snooze. Time to wake up. I was last here 2 years ago. I was pro bono counsel for the Coalition for Green Capital. I want to tell you a little about what we are. We are, I think, what's going to be the first national green bank in the U.S. And the regulatory framework that we're operating under is Section 134 of the Clean Air Act, which was added under IRA. We went through the reconciliation process, which was probably not the ideal way to do this, but it's where we ended up. Basically, under this section of the Clean Air Act, EPA has $27 billion of money basically to provide as grants to entities that are primarily focused on reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and other forms of air pollution, but there's also an environmental justice overlay to that as well, the EJ40 concept. That $27 million was broken up into 3 buckets. The largest of the buckets was $14 billion, and that was for 3 to 5 entities that would be this essentially national green bank type entities. We applied for some of that 14. When I talked to folks here 2 years ago, I had said we were going to apply for a big chunk of it. We applied for 10, we got 5. There were 2 other winners. We ended up, as I said, getting 5. We have 3 objectives in terms, these are all statutory for us, as we are supposed to reduce emissions or avoid emissions of greenhouse gases and other forms of air pollution, and that's very critical. We are supposed to deliver the benefits of clean energy to communities across the country. That has kind of been read into the EJ40 component of what we do. And last but not least, because the amount of money that we've been given in total in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction program is a drop in the bucket, is we're supposed to be basically mobilizing private capital investment to achieve these ends. So, as I mentioned before, there are 3 entities that won pieces of the $14 billion. We are a little bit different than 2 of the other winners. The 2 other winners are much more focused on end users, consumers, and housing. We are much more focused on larger projects, more infrastructure type based. The statute basically says, and then the basically program requirements that EPA developed around Section 134 told us that there's sort of 3 priority category areas of projects and then a 4th category, which we all loosely describe as other. Those 3 priority categories are distributed energy generation and storage, zero emission buildings, and then zero emission transportation. That other category can include lots of different things, including enabling technologies. We, CGC, we have been funded. We have received our grant award from EPA. We are up and running. We have gone basically from being a public advocacy group from 2 years ago to now we're an impact investment fund. We have started hiring professional folks to come work for us. If actually folks are looking for a job and you're good at this, look us up. We're looking for people. We've already built up a team of about 30 people in the last 6 months. And we have, most of us coming from the private sector side have at least 20 to 25 years experience actually playing with other people's money and knowing what to do with it. But we are, in terms of our investment philosophy, a little bit different than the other 2 winners because, again, we're larger projects. When you look across the entire program, we all have metrics we're supposed to hit under the program regarding emissions reductions, what we're doing on the EJ front, and that is defined in particular around what are you doing to provide benefits, and those benefits are wide-ranging, could be reduction in energy burden, job creation, economic development. What are you doing that's particularly focused in low-income and disadvantaged communities, and that's a defined term under the regs for us. And then again, this whole notion of what are you doing to mobilize private capital. Now, what do we think about that? So there's this definition of qualified projects. What are those? So those are projects that would reduce or avoid emissions of greenhouse gases and other forms of air pollution. We're going to provide those additional benefits to communities across the country. And here it's important the way, and I put some things in green to sort of be kind of environmental, and the red is a little bit more financial. But the notion here is we're investing in things that may not otherwise have been financed. So it's a slightly different notion of additionality than what you've heard about today. It's financial additionality. But then we also need to mobilize private capital. And so our targets on mobilization of private capital, we are basically, as compared to the 2 other grantees, think we can recycle our capital much more quickly and on a larger scale. Why that's important, I'll explain in a minute. And then a last constraint for everything we do, and this sort of differentiates us from the other large financial programs that are out there dealing with clean energy technologies, particularly DOE and the Loan Programs Office. We are supposed to focus on commercially proven technologies. We're not in the business of doing financing first of a kind or innovative technologies. We have tremendous flexibility with what we can do with the capital we have, which is we can basically be anywhere in the capital stack for a project. Our notion of what we want to try to do here is, honestly, and again, I'll explain this a little more in detail, is we want to be as small a piece in the capital stack as we possibly can. We want to invest in the projects that we think provide the greatest benefits, and we want to be able to recycle our investments so we can do that again. Because the more we do that, the more emissions reductions and other benefits we can create. Again, our focus is a little different than the 2 other winners. When we think about the types of deals that we're interested in, we're looking at things roughly in the $50 to $300 million range. And again, some of the bigger projects we're looking at, that means we're going to be probably a tiny piece in the capital stack, and what we're really trying to do is go find some bottleneck risk that is preventing that last bit of financial, whatever it needs to come in for somebody to make that final investment decision and say that project's going to happen. So how do we think about emissions? I put accounting here in quote because the way we kind of think about it maybe is a little different than you might think about it accounting. I typically think about accounting, and when you think about the GHG protocols, it's sort of an after the fact, what did I do? I had a footprint, did I do something to deal with my footprint? That's not our perspective. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take the limited amount of public funding we have, and we're trying to get the biggest bang for the buck with that dollar of public money. And so What do we mean by financial additionality? It is we want to invest in things that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. How do we then think about that, what that means in terms of emissions? It is, well, we're already investing in something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Now what we're thinking about is, I really want to try to optimize around avoidance or emissions of actual physical emissions in the world. Now, we're jurisdictionally limited. What we're doing, our investments are all in the US. And obviously, if I were truly optimizing, I would probably look beyond. As you heard from the first panel this morning, you might be better off actually investing that in the US, but that is a constraint we face, right? We have to do what we're doing, we have to do in the US. But we're very much focused on this notion of trying to reduce emissions. But again, we have these other objectives as well. So every investment we're going to make is likely going to be a trade-off. And why is that? Well, if you think about, we have an EJ obligation. We want to do things that benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities. The trilemma of emissions in the US is those communities don't create a lot of emissions. They suffer the consequences of those emissions, and they don't have the means to adapt to those consequences, but they don't create the emissions. Now, if you reduce emissions, and I know there was a question with the first panel this morning thinking about this from an equity perspective, ultimately reducing emissions benefits those LIDACs, but you may not be doing other things that we want to be doing under the program and then what we're supposed to be doing under the statute, which is we actually want to be doing things that we're reducing these other forms of air pollution in those communities. There are local pollutants, of what people might think of as co-benefits, potentially huge. But we also want to do things to reduce energy burdens in those communities, and right, we also want to do things to do economic development. We want to build up workforces in those communities. We want to actually build up entrepreneurial people in those communities to actually be able to provide products, goods, and services in those communities. So how do we then, in all of that, if we're balancing emissions, how do we think about it? Well, you heard about this morning in the first panel, this notion of marginal emissions. We're very focused on that. And that's what we're going to look at. But honestly, the thing that matters to us is probably not so much short run, it's more the long run. And that raises interesting questions when you start to think about the types of investments. And I can give you two examples we're looking at. One is in an actual disadvantaged rural community. It's a tribal community. This may be one of the first investments we do. If we were to actually make the investment today from an emission standpoint, it wouldn't look good. But what we're going to do by making the investment we're going to do is we're going to lower the cost of an existing clean energy resource that serves that community so that more people will take advantage of it, and we can actually then deploy end-use electrification technologies in that community to reduce emissions in the community. You looked at a snapshot today of what we're doing. We're actually not doing anything from an emissions perspective, but if you looked at it from a longer run perspective, we actually are doing something. And I will tell you another good example. I mentioned this other category of qualified projects. One that we're particularly focused on, transmission and interconnection for new renewable resources. We all know, anybody who lives in this world, huge problem. There's a big bottleneck. There are things we think we can do there. But again, is how do you think about if you wanted to go help and basically have somebody build a new interregional transmission line? It's not an actual renewable energy project in and of itself. It's just moving electrons from one place to another. But if you look at it from a long-run perspective, basically what you've done is you've given market access to a region that maybe a region is the best place to go put new clean energy. And so in a sense, you've had a huge impact. But if you think of it from a short-run perspective, you haven't. Now, that's not to say we don't care about the short run. EPA, we have lots of people looking at what we're doing and lots of strings over what we're doing, and we have very robust compliance and reporting requirements. We have to report on about 45 different things in terms of what we would call outputs and outcomes. And I will just give you, if you think about it in the environmental area, we not only have to report to EPA, and these are going to be after the fact snapshots. You made an investment, what actually resulted. We're going to have to report on CO2 equivalents. We're going to have to report on methane. But there's 15 other air pollutants we have to report on. A lot of those, again, are going to be things that are more like you would think of in the local benefit category, local community benefit, co-benefits. So we have a slightly different perspective. We are an impact fund. We need to focus on the long run. Now, what does that mean for us from an investment philosophy? It is, we think that emissions reductions longer term for us are going to be a function of three things, which is how clean is our investment portfolio? That is, we are going to go try to put as little capital as we can in as many good clean energy projects as we can. And then there's this portfolio leverage notion of that's where it's, again, I want to put as little of public money into that project as I can. What I'm trying to do is create a way to crowd in private capital. Because again, we're just a drop in the bucket. We're talking about a problem that's a $500 billion investment problem every year that needs to be made in this country if we're going to hit the administration's climate targets. We're just a drop in the bucket. We have to figure out ways to get 10 and 20x capital mobilization for every dollar of what we're doing. And then this plays into that is this notion of recycling. Now this tells you something about us that's a little bit different. If you're going to recycle something in the capital markets, that means you have to sell it. If you're going to sell it, that means somebody has to want to buy it. People are not going to buy something that's underwater. They're going to want to buy something that they think they can get a return on. That means we have to be careful about what we invest in. The things we invest in, it doesn't mean every project we will do has to mean we make money doing the project, or it's a profitable project that we can go out and resell our financial interest in it. But it does mean on a portfolio basis, that's the way we have to operate. And so this is an important message for folks. If you're looking for money from us, we are not in the concessional capital business for the most part. What we're trying to do is we're trying to my point of, again, we want to invest in the best projects from an emissionality standpoint. We want to use as little public money in doing that as we possibly can, and we want to recycle that as quickly as we can. And that is my comments. Thanks. Any questions?
Okay, two quick administrative things. You can begin writing down any questions you have for the panelists on your cards for being collected. And also the coveted CLE code is KZ674, KZ674. All right, my first question is for Professor Yona. In your article, Emissions, which is one of our CLE readings, you write of the GHG protocol that its present-day use, both insofar as the number of users as well as its scale and scope of analysis, has eclipsed its initial design and intended audience. What did you mean by that, and how does that statement relate to the way that laws have begun to reference scope, the GHG protocol, and perhaps give it teeth that it doesn't have by itself?
I'll speak up, but you all hear me? Yes, no, okay.
Uh-oh. Do you want to steal Tom's?
This one work?
That works.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll start off by saying, I think what the GHG protocol is trying to do is ambitious and important. And, I appreciated Michael's comments in the first panel about just everything that, it's trying to reach. And I think you maybe talked about some of the limitations as well, or what the protocol is intending to be in terms of a standard. So, I think it's common knowledge, even though maybe today we're thinking about the GHG protocol as being this all-encompassing gold standard, back in 2 decades ago when it was first starting out, I don't think anybody had an expectation that it would then be incorporated by reference 2 decades later by the Securities and Exchange Commission and meant to be applied to all publicly traded firms as part of a mandated disclosure requirement. And what that means is that you then have so many different sectors that the protocol is trying to cover. You have corporations at very different scales with very different activities trying to account for their emissions, and it's just a very complex and unwieldy process. And I think for me, if we're taking it back to what I imagine accounting, effective greenhouse gas accounting ought to incorporate, it's that we ought to be able to adapt and incorporate emerging scientific information as it comes along, so that can be, put into our overall inventories and then applied to our decision-making processes. So one, thing for me that is particularly compelling about the California bill to account for emissions is that the bill itself right now is looking at the GHG protocol as the standard that it's going to apply. But it includes a carve-out to with enough of an on-ramp for firms to kind of adjust accordingly, but they're leaving the door open to incorporating other standards in 5 years or 10 years as they may become available. And so I think for me the biggest element is having that adaptability and that nimbleness to evolve along with the scientific information that is becoming available to us.
Thank you. This question for Dr. Budden. So you've explained the 3 pillars. 45V we've heard about a few times. What's the current status of the 45V rulemaking, and what's the argument that the 3 pillars are legally required by the statutory language, and the audience can see the definition of life cycle GHG emissions, which I'm sure you have memorized at this point?
Yes. So right now we have a proposed rule from Treasury that was issued back in December, thanks to Leehi Batchelder and her team, and that we're expecting that to be finalized at some point soon-ish. I have no idea what the exact timeline will be for that, but that proposal, has the 3 pillars. It has a phased implementation of hourly matching by 2028, but otherwise, contains the 3 pillars in their kind of true form, and that phased implementation is just similarly to the EU, justified by getting up hourly tracking systems across the country. Although, as many of you know, I'm sure there's already hourly tracking going on all over the country, so that shouldn't take too long. PGM, for example, already has hourly tracking. But to get to the legal justification, the definition of life cycle emissions analysis for this statute references the Clean Air Act, Section 211. And it says it has to include direct and significant indirect emissions, including all stages of fuel and feedstock production. We believe, and the EPA, the DOE, and Treasury all believe that indirect grid emissions clearly fall within that scope. I think that once you have made that argument that the indirect grid emissions are within that scope, which I think is very clear, then you have to think about what's the best system to account for those. And in the long-run marginal emissions modeling that we see, and the huge body of research that's kind of come to light over the last couple of years, the 3 pillars have emerged as the both administrable but most accurate way to do this. So that's the legal basis, is that this is the best way to make sure we account for those emissions that are clearly included in the scope of the life cycle. Without the 3 pillars or some similar system, you just cannot meet the thresholds that are in the statute, at least until the grid is entirely emissions free. Yeah.
Commissioner Plant. During our keynote speech, we heard about the experience of leading the Treasury Department when it's suddenly been tasked with emissions accounting responsibilities. We've heard sort of a similar plight at the Colorado PUC, dealing with emissions accounting, and we haven't talked about it yet, but also the Colorado hydrogen tax credit context. What's your experience been like as a utility regulator when these emissions accounting responsibilities have been thrust upon you? Yeah.
Farm it out. Yeah, we do rely on the Department of Environment to do a lot of the calculation of the impacts as we're considering them at the commission from the utility proposals. But a lot of this, particularly around, you mentioned the hydrogen, we do look at a variety of different ways in which we can decarbonize. Certainly in the industrial sector, we think that hydrogen can play an important role. In the clean heat plan, green hydrogen was an allowable clean heat resource. And our major utility, Xcel Energy, proposed using hydrogen to inject into the natural gas system as a way of trying to reduce the carbon impact of the natural gas system through in compliance with the objectives of the clean heat plan. Two problems. One was that it wasn't green hydrogen, and in order to be a certified clean heat resource according to the statute, it needed to be green hydrogen. They were proposing to do it as a pilot with the expectation that that would potentially lead to a larger program where they would implement green hydrogen and be able to achieve those emissions reductions. But the problem was that, a couple of problems. One, they had no idea how much the green hydrogen would cost because we don't have any kind of processing in Colorado for that. But also couldn't really point to what the impacts would be on the consumer side, and we had some real concerns about that. Number one, because they were proposing to do this in a neighborhood that was disproportionately impacted, and also because we had concerns around the level of combustion within people's residences for appliances that were perhaps older and wouldn't be combusting the natural gas in the same way as it would if it were 100% natural gas, and that could have severe health impacts. And so we rejected those efforts, but we did ask them to go out and look at some of the industrial applications and to further look at getting green hydrogen for the next clean heat plan, where they might be able to incorporate those things. But the hydrogen tax credit and a number of the hydrogen rulemakings that we're supposed to undertake were sort of delayed because it was targeted at the hydrogen hub that was proposed in Colorado along with a couple of other states, and that did not win approval, so that whole process got delayed a bit.
Following up on the hydrogen tax credit in Colorado, if it ever materializes, and this could be for Dr. Budden or you, Commissioner Plant, what does that statute say? What emissions accounting specifications are in the Colorado statute that aren't in the federal one? How will that conversation unfold differently based off of what is written in the law?
Yes, so I was a little involved with this legislation in Colorado. So at the time, we were doing a lot of work to try and raise the profile of the risks of hydrogen with policymakers in Colorado, particularly around induced grid emissions. So I think a lot of the climate leaders in the administration and the legislature were really keen to put something in this bill to make sure that we weren't going to, delay the retirement of coal plants, like derail the decarbonization of the grid in the name of producing hydrogen. And so at the time, this was before there was even a proposed rule for 45V, and so the kind of terrain was a little more unclear. We were pretty clear-eyed about where we thought 45V should land, but we didn't know where it would land. We still don't know for sure where we finalized. So we worked with the legislature to make sure there was kind of a backstop, because the instinct was like, this is a big question. Defining hydrogen, maybe we shouldn't do this in every state. We should just defer to the feds. But given the uncertainty at the time and the desire to take a leadership role and put a stake in the ground and say that we do not want to produce and greenwash dirty hydrogen and label it clean and give it taxpayer subsidies, we want to put like some guardrails in place in case that doesn't land in the right place. So the statute actually says if the three pillars are, is it on the screen right now? If the three pillars are in place, we will use those in the 45V rules. But if not, by 2028, Commissioner Tom and his colleagues will implement rules to that effect. It leaves a lot up to, obviously there's a lot of details in the implementation of this. We had a lot of those details in the first panel, but it leaves a lot to that public process that the PUC would go through. I think part of the delay as well as obviously the hub is that we don't have a final rule for 45V yet. So like the need for a really expansive process in Colorado, there may be less need for that if they can mostly just adopt the 45V rules.
It's a question for Michael. We heard in your introductory remarks on the role of emissions accounting by your investment fund under the GGRF and how the concept appears in your grant award. Can you talk like more granularly about this? Like get into the details for us.
So we had to describe in our application for the grant, and then there was a work plan that was included in the application that once we were selected, we had to revise. That is not public yet. In that work plan, we promised certain emission reductions over time. And we basically have different milestones we have to meet at like a 3, a 7, and a 10-year period. Our actual period of performance under our grant award, and if anybody's familiar with how grants work with government agencies, there's a certain period of time you're supposed to hit certain metrics. Our period of performance is actually 3 years, and the reason for that on our end is because we're going to spin through the money we got relatively quickly, again, part of this notion of recycling. So that's about as granular as I can get in terms of what they've required of us. It's interesting, the areas where they put in the grant award very clear direction to us was on the private capital mobilization. We had a very aggressive private capital mobilization rate in our application compared to the two other winners. We are being held to that, though it's a commercially reasonable standard. And then in terms of our commitment, our EJ commitment, we actually went above and beyond the 40%. We said we'll do 50%. We are being held to that requirement. But I think not in a hard and fast, it's more loose. You definitely have to hit the 40, and aspirationally you should hit the 50. And if you don't hit the 50, you better have a good reason why you didn't.
So what do you know thus far about what emissions accounting methods?
So what EPA has used to date for us is AVERT. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with that tool. It's the Avoided Emissions in Generation. It is a marginal emissions tool. It is not particularly granular. And actually, as we've been kicking the tires on, we're open for business. People have been coming to us with investment proposals. We've had to start taking a look at those. AVERT, I just know from some of the things we've looked at, we cannot capture really what's going on. And I'll give you an example. Somebody brought to us a repowering project for a renewable project in a particular area. And if you looked at that project in AVERT, which looks at a broader geographic area over a bigger period of time, it looked perfectly fine. But I was looking at how often this project had been curtailed before they were talking about expanding the capacity, and it was very clear what this project was in an area where it was a renewable project competing against other renewable projects. So all we were going to do if we had done that deal was we were just going to push some other renewable project farther down the supply stack.
Got it.
But I do want to answer, we're waiting for EPA to give us guidance, and it's an interesting problem that we have. One, we got to make sure EPA tells all of us under the GGRF that we're using the same metrics to measure and report what we're doing. But honestly, it's a bigger problem. There are lots of different government programs that we interact with and that other people interact with, and everybody has different rules and different measurements. And it is not ideal.
Professor Yona, I want to yank us back to the SEC. So what is the current status of the SEC's climate disclosure rule, and how does it stack up against the principles for good emissions accounting that you outlined in your article?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the principle for good emissions accounting, because I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on what you were talking about, Michael. I think one of the biggest challenges for regulators as well as reporters, so inventory reporters, so governments or corporations, is this inconsistency across different standards and reporting requirements, which is a burden right on the reporters themselves, but also makes it very difficult if you're a member of, if you're kind of a regulator trying to assess compliance, but let alone, like, God forbid, a member of the public trying to understand, how much progress has a particular actor made in reducing their emissions. It becomes very, very difficult to actually assess that compliance, and so, that progress. And so, in my mind, some of these core principles are, one, some type of standardization or at least comparability. I say, I'd like to be able to compare Apple to Alphabet. If I'm an investor looking to know which firm to invest in, I should be able to look at these tech companies that are of similar-ish size and be able to, assess what kind of progress they're making. But right now, not only do we not have that, we don't even have that for, looking at the consistency within a particular inventory compiler. Year to year, does an actor have consistency in their reports? So, that's a very important principle, at least having some kind of interoperability. It doesn't mean that we'd have one standard for everyone, but at the very least, use the same language. If I said reporting in a governmental context, that means something entirely different and has different legal implications than in a corporate context, and that's a problem in my view. And so, kind of within those principles, the SEC rule, for folks in the room who are maybe less familiar with where it is right now. So the rule was finalized earlier this year, and as expected, there was a flurry of litigation, and so it is being held up in courts. The SEC has stayed their hand, meaning that they're kind of willing to hold back on actually implementing this rule for the sake of having the litigation kind of make its way through the courts more quickly. The final rule excluded Scope 3 emissions accounting, which I think was a disappointment for a lot of people. And I also think, though, from a legal perspective, when we have cases like West Virginia versus EPA, where the Supreme Court effectively held that the EPA dealing with climate change could be a kind of a major questions issue, and not within the EPA scope of authority, absent a congressional mandate, you would expect that a similar kind of challenge for the SEC would probably be successful. I think quite a few people might argue that the SEC is not within its authority to try to mandate climate disclosure, even though I would disagree with that claim. So, I think with West Virginia and with Loper Bright, I don't know how hopeful I am for the survival of the SEC's rule, but what I would say I am excited about is that California bill, in part because it has that adaptability, that emphasis on reporting of public as well as private entities, as long as you're kind of operating within the state and have $1 billion of revenue, and that it's looking to be more adaptable. And some folks argue that without an SEC rule around climate disclosure, that actually might make it easier for California to survive the lawsuits that they're certainly going to receive, in kind of saying, we're not being preempted by any kind of federal action. And so, it's disappointing to see how things are going with what I see as a really robust, especially the proposed rule from the SEC was quite robust. But I think right now the main positives that I'm seeing as a result of this rule are that many companies are trying to comply with the disclosure requirements regardless of what the outcome is of the litigation, in anticipation of the requirements themselves. And so perhaps there will be this inertia that will take place where you might see firms complying with the disclosure even absent the actual rule as it currently stands.
And just to nail down exactly what the SEC rule is doing, can you talk a little bit more specifically about what it requires of the companies, where it gives them freedom, and how that compares to any other regimes?
Yes. So full disclosure, no pun intended, I brought a copy of the rule because I don't know this off by heart. Some of you do. I am very deep respect to you. I think to me, the SEC rule has a lot of flexibility. There's a safe harbor provision, and so even within the reporting requirements, we still, in my view, created a scenario where, to what I was saying at the very beginning of the answer here, where you might not actually be able to have comparability in the way that one would like to have. And so the flexibility is an issue. I think generally the rule itself is, requiring disclosure in a lot of important sectors, so scope 1, scope 2, but for many companies, like, not to pick on the tech industry, but the tech sector is one such company where most of the emissions are scope 3 emissions. You're missing a big part of the picture there.
Commissioner Plant, I'm going to serve you sort of like two combined questions, and you can pick and choose. So when the time comes that you're implementing these emissions accounting systems, what types of information and comments would be most useful to you as a regulator from the stakeholders that are engaged in the process? And also, how can NGOs and think tanks best help state actors like PUCs? How should they prioritize their state actions given their limited resource focus on big states? Should they prioritize big states like California and New York, or under-resourced states instead?
Well, I'll do the second one first. I don't know that some of the high-resource states necessarily need a lot of assistance. I think one of the things that we at the Commission benefit from is from input from a wide variety of interveners. We generally hear from the same people. And so getting those additional perspectives and those additional outside eyes looking at the ways in which we're implementing these policies is very helpful to us, both to get additional perspectives, but also to build the record. We can only make a determination based on the evidentiary record. So if we can get more input from others, that's extremely helpful. And we don't have the resources of California or one of those larger states. So it is very, very helpful and very appreciated. And what was the first question again?
When it comes time, when the rubber hits the road and you're picking an emissions accounting system, what kind of information is persuasive to you as a regulator when you're picking and choosing among some of the systems we've talked about in the first panel?
Yeah. So one of the things that, obviously as economic regulators, we have an obligation to achieve the emissions reductions, but we don't want to do it at any cost. And so we really need to be looking at a wide variety of potential approaches to achieving those reductions. One of the things that I think we're going to be focusing more on in the future is the distribution system and the ways in which the distribution system and management of the distribution system can reduce investments overall in the larger bulk system. And that's a connection that we've discussed, but it hasn't really been made within the intervening comments, particularly as it relates to when we go to a large clean energy plan. Most of the focus is on the bulk system. Most of the focus is on, how many gigawatts of solar and wind and storage and things are we bringing into the system. And as has been discussed earlier, that also has a huge impact on our transmission costs. The more we have a reliance on the transmission, the more impact we have when that is delayed, which is a real concern for commissions right now. And the ways in which we can reduce those necessary investments by making larger investments in the distribution system where we actually can achieve that deployment, I think is a connection that really needs to be made within the regulatory environment, not just in Colorado, but all over the country.
Question for Michael. So, and here's another combined question. So you have this $5 billion to spend. There's competing priorities. How will they be balanced? Like, is there a scoring system? Like, how will EJ be pitted or balanced against emissions reductions versus the recycling versus the other factors that you have to consider?
I think for us, it's going to be case by case.
Okay.
And again, but if you think about what I was talking about before, and what I didn't mention, of our $5 billion, we have a number, CGC, we have helped stand up state and local green banks across the country. Some of the money we're going to pass down to them. They're going to do things that are probably going to be more consumer facing than what we do. But if you think about our deals are in that 50 to 300 million, we're not going to do that many deals. And I think for us, it's going to be a really interesting, every deal we do is going to be a discussion. And yes, there will be metrics we're going to look at, but honestly, at the end of the day, it's going to be a qualitative analysis of looking at what we're doing and then picking sort of the best. And there clearly will be projects that we're going to do that are going to be concessional because we think they have a huge impact. We're probably not going to do many of those. There are clearly going to be projects we're going to do where there might not be a great emissions reduction story. I think every project we do, we have to do something. We have to demonstrate we've reduced or avoided emissions. But there may be ones we will do that are going to be more focused on reducing energy burdens in a community or dealing with other forms of air pollution or economic development, and less about that. So it's always going to be this balancing act. Because if we weren't doing a balancing act and we were just focused on emissions reductions, we would probably put every dollar we have into transmission, honestly. And in fact, I tell this to the corporate guys all the time. If you really cared about emissions, you'd be putting all your money, rather than cleaning up your footprint, you'd be cleaning up the grid, and you'd be putting money in transmission, and you'd be putting money in things so we could actually interconnect all of the stuff sitting in the interconnection queues, because there's more than enough of it. We just can't get it connected to the grid. It's not about your footprint, it's about the grid.
All right, this will be our last question. Dr. Budden, following on Michael's discussion of additionality and emissionality, I wanted to dig deeper onto the definition of additionality in the hydrogen context. Can you explain the proposed 3-year heuristic that's being used as a proxy for additionality, and explain why this does or does not do the trick?
Yeah, so, no, it's a great question. The philosophical idea of additionality is the same as how Michael's been describing it, is would this have been built were it not for me? So applying that to hydrogen, it's would this renewable energy project that I'm contracting for energy or buying the attributes from, would it have been there were it not for the demand for its energy or environmental attributes from the hydrogen producer? That's very difficult to prove. And so we have heuristics, and the proxy of the 3-year vintage requirement is the one that has emerged both in the EU and the proposed rule from Treasury as the proxy for that additionality. Obviously, that's a lower bar than truly knowing for sure that this wouldn't have been built without the hydrogen producer's demand. And it also allows a healthy amount of flexibility, I think, to hydrogen producers. They can procure power from anything that was coming online 3 years or less before the hydrogen producer starts producing. And then onwards, they can keep looking for new sources of power and contract with them. So you have a 3-year window that grows to a 4 or 5 or 6-year window as your hydrogen plant ages. If that makes sense, because it's a 10-year lifetime of the credit from when you start producing hydrogen. And what we've seen in the modeling is when you look at the likes of Princeton University's modeling, looking at long-run marginal emissions impacts, this vintage requirement, when it's coupled with the geographic and hourly temporal requirements, does do the job essentially of not increasing emissions on the grid as a result of this hydrogen. I mean, there are some other models that say even with this additionality requirement, we still might be in the grid in total as a system, the energy system in total will have more emissions than if we just didn't make any hydrogen at all, because you're like cannibalizing renewable projects that might have been built anyway. But nonetheless, this is the best system that we have, and in a lot of models, it does come out as not reducing emissions. So the short answer is yes, it basically does do the trick.
Thank you. Coffee's over there. Next panel starts at 2:30. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.